Welcome back to this last part of Mayflower. George here. So now Richard Warren and the rest of the Pilgrims who survived were now establishing the Plymouth colony. And this time we're going to look at their early years when they're there, and then at the enormous impact that this has had on Western civilization ever since. Thanksgiving Day you will know about. I wonder if you know where and when it started. And in fact, it started with the Pilgrims in 1621. They'd gone through this dreadful experience on the voyage over through the winter, half of their people dying. And the Thanksgiving Day was held in the autumn of 1621 to give thanks, firstly for survival, but secondly for the good harvest that they got. They'd now got plenty of food from their crops, and their treaty and friendship with the Indians had helped them survive. And so there were 90 native Indians, 90 Wampanoag, joined them in this 3-day feast on corn, venison, and fowl. They had a lot to give Thanksgiving for, and that's become a national day of Thanksgiving in America. In 1863, President Abraham Lincoln proclaimed this national day, and it is now held every year, as I'm sure you know, on the fourth Thursday in November, and when all Americans gather for a day of feasting, football, and family. Very special. So the Plimoth Plantation grew up, and here are a couple of photos from the modern Plymouth Plantation showing the sort of housing that they had, and work in the fields. And some of the settlers from Leiden, when the Mayflower got back, it brought the news, and some of the settlers from Leiden were in London. And tradesmen, of course, were important to establish the community, builders and others and so forth. So they recruited some more, and in November, the Fortune arrived with 36 more passengers, including Philippe de Lannoy, who I mentioned earlier. 2 years later, 2 more ships, the Anne and Little James, brought another 100 or so immigrants. So there were now some 200 people living there and starting to form a proper livelihood. In 1623, the land that they had was divided amongst the settlers. And this deal with the adventurers to fund them in the first place hadn't worked out all that well. Goods were sent back, but not as much as they'd hoped. Anyway, they finally reached agreement with these adventurers to sell all stock, shares, land, and merchandise and chattels to, by then, 58 purchasers among the settlers. In 1627, the cattle that they had, again, were divided among the people. And then started what's known as the Great Migration. This was the first successful colonization of the New World, and it's done by the English as opposed to the Spanish, French, and Dutch, who all did little bits and pieces. And 13 colonies would develop. And if we look at the impact on Western civilization, here is the east coast of America, and we can see New York. We can see Boston and Plymouth and Cape Cod are just below there. And then there are other places, you'll know, Philadelphia. And what would eventually become the States. Colonies developed all the way up the East Coast here, in the Carolinas, Virginia, and so forth. And you can see, before 1660, they were very much on the coast, and then gradually they pushed back into the inland a bit, 1700, and by 1760, there were colonies up and down this coast. And that was very crucial in all sorts of ways. There were 13 colonies, which would eventually become 13 states. Things were very much based on religious freedom. And we talked about the Mayflower Compact as being important in that, agreeing religious freedom. A lot of people from Europe were fleeing from the religious persecution and otherwise things in their own country. Trade and commerce became very important, and we'll probably know about it instinctively. We'll talk about that, particularly in relation to Scotland in a moment. But trading started with bringing things back from America, with selling things to America. And immigration from many, many countries, not just from England or Scotland or whatever, but from all sorts of countries in Europe and beyond that. And it's very much seen as being the most influential journey in Western history. So we mentioned Scotland. Of course, Scotland, like England, tried to colonize in America, and Nova Scotia, New Scotland, they were attempting that about the same time as the Mayflower, but eventually they abandoned that. They went to Cape Breton, because Canada as well as America was part of this initiative, but that was never colonized. And just in passing, of course, Scotland had its religious problems. The Church of Scotland was there, but in 1638, the National Covenant was signed. And I won't go into the detail here, but a lot of persecution resulted from that. Late 1600s, Scotland again tried in East New Jersey with some success, but that was slowing after a few years. In Stewartstown, again, they landed, but the Spanish wiped them out. And then most Scots will know about the disastrous Darien scheme. Basically, North and South America, if you think about it, it's just a solid landmass from north to south. How do you get goods from the Atlantic to the Pacific and vice versa? So the plan was to encourage and develop trading from the Pacific to the Atlantic across what we now know as the Panama Canal, then known as Darien. But it was a classic, wildly ambitious scheme, and a great example of if you fail to plan, you plan to fail, and it was a disaster. And so Scotland in the early 1700s was a relatively poor country with limited influence internationally, some, but not a lot of that. And in 1707, the Act of Union with England and Wales was proposed. And the Scots signed up to that quite quickly, providing they got access to these English colonial markets. And Scotland's debts were paid off. And of course, there are pros and cons of the Act of Union. At the time, there were very much those who agreed with it and those who did not agree with it. So we've got the wisdom of hindsight. So let's look at what happened with Scotland and the Union. There was an immediate economic boom. And a great example is Glasgow, where the tobacco lords went to Virginia and places in America and bought back the tobacco and so forth and made vast sums of money. And those of you who know Glasgow will know of a particular quirk. There is a statue of the Duke of Wellington, and some years ago someone put a traffic cone on the top and the police took it off and someone put it back on, So it's now a permanent feature. And behind there is this amazing Greek building, which was a house built by one of the tobacco lords in the 1770s. So next time someone goes to the Royal Exchange Square, that house was built by the Mayflower, by the Act of Union, and Scottish enterprise, because the great thing about the Union was Scotland contributed a lot as well as receiving a lot. But as a bonus, by the mid-18th century, the Industrial Revolution was getting going, and the United Kingdom became the world's first industrialized economy. And if Scotland had actually had a free choice in 1770 about which country to join up with, they could not have chosen better than their neighbours, England and Wales. It was a real case of synergy. 2 and 2 make 5. Scotland were not a lame duck. Scotland contributed a lot, but benefited a lot. And that's seen by in 1850, the United Kingdom had 40% of the total world's trade. And if you look at examples, say for Glasgow, you can see the population in 1700, only 13,000. Almost 6 times that already in 1800, and almost 10 times that in 1900. And so, in the 400th anniversary of the Mayflower, we have the USA and Scotland as part of the United Kingdom as one of the 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, one of only 7 members of the G7 group. So that reflects what had come out of the Mayflower journey and the colonization and so forth. So this